had a shared interest in crypto, and Mark very kindly got in touch and expressed an interest. And when I started to sit down and talk about it with him, it became clear he knew an awful lot more than me, which is good. Is this add? Do I just press add? Yeah, so we got together just before Christmas and thought about how we're going to put a presentation together. So this presentation is split into two parts. The first part, Mark, who is a contracting developer from Krypton, Team Krypton, working on the Navarro project, is going to explain a bit about the technicals of cryptocurrencies, how it came to be, how it's designed to be used, where it might go in the future, what kind of thing affects the value of cryptocurrencies. And then I'm going to actually talk through a bit about my personal journey into mining and explain what that monstrosity of 8 graphics cards is doing just then. So, I'm going to pass this over to Mark.
Hi everyone. So I'm going to do a quick sample of the room. Sorry, Poland, this will be a biased sample. Just a quick show of hands. Who has used cryptocurrency to buy something? 1, 2. Very, very few people. It's not very mainstream. That's okay. So I'll start with a little story. Imagine that you're a refugee and you are running for your life from some oppressive regime. This could be Nazi Germany, it could be Syria, it could be any number of places. In the past, you would be escaping, let's say, under cover of nightfall, leaving all your possessions behind, or maybe carrying a few things that were particularly precious to you. And when you reach safety, you have to start your life again, from scratch. However, there is a mechanism where you could carry your wealth in your head in 12 words, and when you reach safety, you unlock that wealth again, and you continue. This is one of the founding ideas behind cryptocurrencies. The most well-known is Bitcoin, and I'm mostly going to be focusing on that. I will touch a little bit on Ethereum and a few others. Feel free to ask questions, so long as it's not going to take me too long to answer as we go along. Bitcoin is a cryptocurrency. Most of you have heard of it by now. It has an analogy with gold in that there is a limited supply of gold in the ground, limited supply of Bitcoin. It's designed so that over time, a maximum of 21 million Bitcoins will be available. And the problem is, of course, 21 million doesn't sound like a lot. Global commerce, trillions of dollars. However, it is divisible. So you can take a Bitcoin, you can split it down into 100 million individual little bits called Satoshis. There are a few things about Bitcoin that you're probably aware of. The price fluctuation. You might have heard Bitcoin hit $20,000. That was December 2017. That's when a whole lot of us bought loads of Bitcoin and said, wow, it's going to be amazing. It's now worth $3,500. In between, of course, there have been ups and downs. And there are also competitors, lots of other different types of cryptocurrencies. So where did it come from? Well, originally, a guy called Dai Wei released a paper called B-Money. This was 1998. And about the same time, a guy called Nick Szabo presented BitGold, also 1998. It wasn't until 10 years later that somebody came up with an actual practical implementation of a digital currency. And this was Bitcoin, a peer-to-peer electronic cash system by a guy called Satoshi Nakamoto. Who is Satoshi? We don't know. We think possibly he could be Hal Finney, the first guy to carry out a Bitcoin transaction. Could be Nick Szabo, and probably is, but that's my opinion, who was involved in early projects. Wei Dai, who presented the original B-Money. And it's probably not Finney's neighbor, Dorian Nakamoto, who had, well, he was a physicist, but didn't have a lot to do with cryptocurrency. So what actually happens when you use Bitcoin? Most people, when they hear about it, they're like, I don't want to know how it works. I just want to know how I can use it, how I can buy stuff with it. Starts off, let's say you have an app installed on your phone, and you're going to buy some product. It could be hosting services for a website, or it could be in a shop where you're actually buying some physical good. So you request a transaction. That then gets transmitted to the network. I want to transfer my Bitcoin to the vendor. It falls into a pool of transactions which haven't been verified. So there are lots of participants in the network. We all want it to work correctly and safely. And so you have a group of people involved called validators. That's a broad term. They're sometimes called miners. And they take these transactions, collect them up into a block, and they solve a hard cryptographic puzzle. It forces them to expend resources, energy, to solve this puzzle. And if they are the first to find the answer, they get a reward. That is a reward for their expenditure of energy. And they are there to ensure that the network is secure. That if you are spending coins, the network makes sure that you have those coins to spend. Also, that you don't try and spend them twice. We'll come on to that later. It gets appended as a block, all these transactions, to a ledger. It's a spreadsheet which is distributed around everyone who participates. You can imagine a simple ledger of transactions. Each one is added to the last. And that is called a blockchain. Now, of course, you've heard blockchain, possibly. It's a buzzword which has gone around. What does it actually mean? Well, it's only a small technical part of what makes Bitcoin possible. It is also now a largely meaningless term. To misquote a famous cryptographic speaker, he said, well, it's the technology behind Bitcoin, but you could say network is the technology behind the internet. And of course, as soon as you create a buzzword out of it, 1,000 consultants will jump out of the woodwork and say, we can do Bitcoin, we can do network, pay us lots of money, we'll do it for you. But the key part of this blockchain is that it is immutable. That means that if you spend money, you publish the transaction, no one can come back later on and erase that transaction, say that you didn't spend it. And the way that is accomplished is with a mechanism called proof of work. This is what the miners do. This is what validators in the network do. Proof of work depends on a mathematical function. It has to be either energy intensive or some other form of maybe memory intensive. All right. No. And in the case of Bitcoin, they use a mathematical function called, well, an algorithm called Hashcash. So I'll give you a little demonstration of what that is. So let's say there are a whole lot of transactions in this block. It's published on the network, and the miners get to work solving the cryptographic puzzle. What they're solving is, given all these transactions, can I add some value so that when I run my calculations over it, I end up with another value with some number of zeros at the beginning? It's a fairly arbitrary choice of what the answer to the puzzle is. Bitcoin chooses to have a number of zeros at the beginning. There are other methods. So here you've got, if I execute that, here it's generating a block of transactions which are published in the network. It's now adding in some number which it has to work out by brute force, and hashing and hashing and hashing until it comes up with the right answer the network wants to see, which is something beginning with a 0. This required only 0.275 seconds to complete, so that's a pretty easy thing to calculate. But of course, systems like Bitcoin make it a lot harder, so you have to expend a lot more energy in order to solve them. Let's, for example, make that 2 zeros at the beginning. That may or may not execute quickly enough. Okay, so it found an answer to it in just under 1 second. But over time, with Bitcoin, as more and more blocks are produced, it gets harder and harder to solve these puzzles. It gets harder and harder because the network says, I now want an answer which has 17 zeros at the beginning. So this is the fundamentals of proof of work. Let's go back. So what does it actually solve? Well, the major problem is double spending. If your Bitcoin is just some data, well, what stops you from copying that data? What stops you from spending it in two different places? The fundamental part of this is that all of the miners and the validators are working together to build a consensus of, okay, you spent the coins here. You can't now keep on spending them somewhere else. However, there is a way to subvert that, and it's called the double spending or 51% attack. Starts off, you have a number of blocks in the blockchain, each of which has got transactions in it, and we all agree that the green ones represent the transactions that have occurred. Somebody bought a Lamborghini, they transferred some Bitcoin from one person to another in one of the blocks. However, say you are, the guy in red, a malicious miner. You're going to try and spend your Bitcoin and then erase the evidence that you spent it. So you'd start off, you publish, along with everybody else, a transaction. Say you spend 100 Bitcoin to buy a Lamborghini. You go down to the Lamborghini dealership, you transfer the Bitcoins, and you drive your Lamborghini away. What you're going to be doing in secret is you're going to be solving the cryptographic puzzles at the same time as everyone else, except your version of it, you haven't spent your coins. Of course, at this point, everyone agrees, yeah, you definitely spent it because that is the longest chain. The longest chain in Bitcoin is a representation of the agreement that, yeah, okay, that's where the transactions were. Then what happens? You add more mining capacity. You buy thousands of rigs so that you can outrace everybody else who's participating, everybody else who's doing all these calculations. You produce answers faster than they can. And then suddenly, you're ahead of them. More transactions are being published on the network, but you're the first to validate them. Except that when you publish your blockchain with your corrupt transaction where you haven't actually spent that 100 Bitcoin for your Lambo, everyone says, oh, well, that's the longest chain. That must be the truth. That must be the real blockchain. Everyone switches over. Now, you haven't spent your 100 Bitcoin, and you still have your Lamborghini. Go buy another Lamborghini. Okay, but why? What actually gives Bitcoin its value? Well, there are a few things. Value in cryptocurrency is largely illusionary. That is true. We think it has value because we have fair confidence that if we spend it, someone else will accept it, and they will be able to spend it later on as well for something. It's not really backed by anything except, as we say, the faith of fools. And that sounds bizarre. How can you have a cryptocurrency which doesn't have any basis of value? But it's not that strange, because if you consider dollars or pounds, they're just as illusory. In 2012, only about 10% of the US dollar supply, which is $1 trillion out of a total of 10 trillion, was in any tangible form. The rest of it was just numbers in a database. And those databases were distributed between banks. With a blockchain, we can centralize those databases. So it used not to be the case. It used to be we had the gold standard, and reserve banks would set aside some gold for every note they issued. That was abandoned in the 1930s. And then we had other mechanisms to push money into the economy. We had fractional reserve, where banks can lend more than they actually have. And we have techniques like quantitative easing, where governments will sell bonds to banks, and in fact, they are creating money out of nothing. So these are all techniques which governments can use to balance the economy. Bitcoin was created in part so that it's incompatible with any of those techniques, so that you don't have governments playing tricks or upsetting the economy by mismanaging it. there's also no need for middlemen in Bitcoin. So whenever you transfer money overseas, you're spending a portion of that as a transaction fee, which goes to the banks. It could be quite a significant portion of what you transfer. And also banking provides security for your funds. I mean, if there's some fraud on your credit cards, you have a fair confidence that you'll be reimbursed. However, Bitcoin is not compatible with this. Security is built into the system. So what happens when governments don't manage the economy properly? Well, between 2011 and 2015, Argentina brought in exchange controls. It meant that if you were an Argentine with pesos, you could only own a certain portion of your wealth, only have it in dollars. If you went overseas and you were spending in a foreign currency, you would get an extra 20 to 40% tax when that was hitting your bank account in Argentina. So what happened was they developed this black market for US dollars in Argentina. And I was there in December 2014, which is near enough for the largest gap between these two lines. So the graph represents if you were going to sell a dollar on the street, how much could you get for it? In the black market, you could get up to 16 pesos for your $1 US. But if you did anything through official channels with the government, exchanging at banks, you were getting a fixed rate of 8, which then, well, rose over time. But clearly there was a large gap between what you could get through official channels and what it was actually worth. I mean, the line at the top is the real worth of a dollar in pesos. So you would walk down the street in Buenos Aires, and you would hear a guy shouting, "Cambio, cambio, cambio." They're calling you to come and exchange your US dollars for pesos. The problem is, if you've been in Argentina for a couple of weeks, as we had, and you've blown through all your US dollars, now what do? You start buying stuff with your foreign credit card. You start exchanging to get pesos at the banks. And suddenly everything's a lot more expensive. Of course, there was an answer. I found a guy who was willing to trade Bitcoin. So I bought some Bitcoin on an exchange in the UK. I went to this guy who was upstairs above a McDonald's, sitting there with a bag full of cash. I said, "Here's my Bitcoin." And he handed over some thousands of pesos. As a side, I now have a pair of boots, which are possibly the most expensive boots I will ever own. More expensive than my car. And I don't even wear them. So now we come on to what actually affects the price, because when I bought them, of course, the boots weren't expensive. When Bitcoin peaked at $20,000, they were very expensive. Over time, this is just looking at one of the exchanges called Mt. Gox. It's infamous, and the price or the value of Bitcoin in US dollars over time. Lots of things. Demand, obviously, as people buy and sell, if they all agree it has some value, then the value adjusts based on supply and demand. There is confidence that other aspect that affects the price is confidence in the whole ecosystem. When Bitcoin was still proving itself, everyone was a bit unsure whether it was going to take off. And Mt. Gox was rather a good illustration of that. The price kept rising as people found uses for Bitcoin until February 2014. Mt. Gox announced that they'd been hacked and they'd lost 100,000 Bitcoins. I can't remember the exact value. And the price plummeted. Well, it wasn't any question of has Bitcoin been hacked or the protocol broken. This was just Mt. Gox were mismanaging funds. They were being siphoned off and they didn't fess up to it. Other things affecting price. Government regulation seems to be a big one at the moment. So anytime they're talking about taxing Bitcoin or capital gains tax is a thing at the moment. Then, of course, there's less demand for it and less money flowing in or out of the system. But that's just Bitcoin. And the one thing I should touch on is a little bit about where we go from here, because it's not just Bitcoin, thousands of other cryptocurrencies. A lot of you have heard of Ethereum. So imagine Bitcoin is a blockchain which allows you to move a value from one wallet to another. What if instead of money and a wallet, it was just a simple operation, an add, a subtract? What do you need to make a basic computer? You need operations, which add two numbers together or subtract. You need some storage, input and output. That you can all achieve within a blockchain. So you could have a transaction in a blockchain which is store this number in this location in the blockchain, and a later transaction which is multiply that number by 2, divide it, decide that if that's a certain number, do something else. You basically have a computer distributed around the world running pretty much anything you like. Obvious idea is a lottery. Why do you want to do a lottery in a distributed computer? Because when lottery organizers run a lottery, they take a large cut. You don't necessarily see how much they take. You don't necessarily trust them. When it's in a blockchain, which is public, you can see exactly how that lottery is run. You can make sure that it is fair when it's distributing winnings. So now we've gone from a blockchain just being a way to move money around to being a way to run computer programs, contracts, if you like, where you don't have to trust the central authority. That's a powerful idea. This guy is Vitalik Buterin, who is the originator of Ethereum. There is one issue that I need to also pick up on. We talked earlier about the double spending problem. If you control a majority of the hashing power, the validation power in the network. And usually with Bitcoin that comes through because you can afford to buy huge racks of custom hardware, which solve that hashing problem very quickly. One of the limitations of the hashing algorithm in Bitcoin is that it's very fast to execute hashes generally. You have to do millions and millions of them, but each individual hash is reasonably quick. If you have a warehouse full of custom hardware, you can control an enormous amount of that processing power. So what Ethereum decided is we need to move away from this, and we need to use a proof-of-work algorithm which is memory hard. That means it requires large amounts of memory in order to do these calculations. Memory is expensive, but I mean, what processors are fast and do have a lot of memory? Graphics cards. So you might have heard I talked about those boots that I bought. Way back at the beginning, there was a guy who decided he would buy some pizza. It was one of the very first Bitcoin transactions. He spent 5,000 Bitcoin on a pizza, or in fact, 10,000 Bitcoin on 2 pizzas. And that was about $30 then. In December 27, that was 198 million pounds. Now it's about 36 million. But if we'd been having pizza today, that would have been slightly more relevant. Anyway, thank you very much.
Brilliant. Yeah. So the mining rig that you see in front of you, when I bought it, the car I transported it in was worth more than that rig. I was petrified about bringing it into work because that rig is now worth more than my car. And that's because it's made up of graphics cards, 1070s. You're just recently superseded by the 20 series of graphics cards, but until recently, a fairly high-end mid-range graphics card. There are 8 of them, and I mine Ethereum, which, as Mark said, is memory intensive, and they've got 8 gigabytes of RAM on them, and I chose those graphics cards because, unlike most 1070s, they're quite high-end versions of them. They ship with Samsung memory, and that 1070 that you see there is able to mine at a 25% higher efficiency than pretty much all the other 1070s on the market because it comes with Samsung memory instead of the usual memory that you see in them. So yeah, that's why I mine Ethereum. What you can see there, and I thank DisplayLink for this because I'm actually mining Ethereum right now. Not very much. And also thank you for the electricity because this is about 1 kilowatt. That's a miner being run just there, if you've been wondering what that is. Sorry, Poland, because you can't see it, the camera's not looking at it, but yeah, that's what a mining application looks like when it's running. So yeah, so thanks. I'm not sure how I followed that because that was very fluid. When I wrote this presentation, I wrote it in the form of a story because that's the best way I thought I could get it all out. So bear with me. So for me, why crypto? Why did I get into crypto? Well, it all started with a conversation with this guy 7 years ago, and that's a photo of my brother-in-law. At the time, I knew nothing about crypto, and I'd never heard of Bitcoin. But as a contracting techie, he had the time and the money to invest in the hardware to mine crypto. The first I knew of what he was up to was when I stepped into his garage in the middle of winter, and I asked, "Why is your garage so hot?" And he said, "I've started mining Bitcoin, and those are my mining rigs." So I was looking at the 48 GPUs sitting on aluminium racks, this photo, trying to understand why anyone outside Pixar would want that kind of graphics horsepower. He went on, "Bitcoin is a digital currency. I'm running these cards 24/7 against an algorithm that generates me Bitcoin. Mining," he said, as if that was an end of it. Why? Because one day Bitcoin will be worth $1 million. Well, he's not a stupid man. He's actually very, very clever. But in that second, he sounded pretty stupid to me. At the time, Bitcoin had a value of $13. A few months later, that had risen to $200. By December 2017, as Mark said, Bitcoin had gone up to $20,000. It's fair to say Bitcoin's value is a speculator's dream, and where there's speculation, there's money to be made. And truthfully, that's why I got into crypto. I saw a way to make a profit. So, bear with me here. It's worth mentioning, over the last 20 years, there's been a few times where I've seen an investment, but I've missed the opportunity. First time I picked up an iPhone, to the first time I searched for something on Google, part of me felt this similar feeling of, wow, this is just how it should be. It just works. If I'd followed that through with an investment, I'd have made a lot of money, but I didn't. I missed the boat. I knew at some point I would find the right investment, and that's why I've got into crypto. So going back to Bitcoin, a few years have passed since that first conversation with my brother-in-law. Whenever the topic came up, it was always, "Look at the size of my portfolio," or words to that effect. Fast forward to 2017, and Bitcoin has stuck around long enough to be more than just a flash in the pan. From every perspective, was showing no sign of stopping. It wouldn't be fair to liken Bitcoin's investment potential at the time to that of an Amazon or a Facebook, which were clearly going to do very well. Bitcoin, 5 years in from when it first started, was a very different project from year one, and where it was always clear where Facebook's IPO would take its business, Bitcoin's long-term format was much harder to predict. It wasn't just Bitcoin. Hundreds of cryptocurrencies have sprung up out of nowhere, and we're now piggybacking off the Bitcoin blockchain, claiming to offer a myriad of different benefits. It was, by all accounts, a crypto gold rush. So I dabbled briefly in CFDs, which are credit for difference, on a platform called eToro. Where's Roy? Sorry, Roy. Yeah, because I kind of got Roy into this at the start of at the height of it all, and yeah, and he's never forgiven me. And CFDs effectively let you bet on a crypto's value going up and down. And in the space of a year, I'd done well enough, Roy hadn't, but I'd done well enough to fund a meaningful investment in mining hardware. And I say meaningful because there is a sweet spot with mining where you need a minimum amount of horsepower of hardware for it to generate enough crypto to justify the cost of the electricity to run the hardware. I've got 4 of these at home, and I spend £300 every month in electricity. And that's a really good electrical deal. In my case, this equated to about £16,000. Now, I had the biggest kid in a candy shop moment of my life the day I logged on to Scan and placed an order for 32 GPUs, 8 power supplies, 4 motherboards, and a lot more besides. I distinctly remember resenting having to pay $4.99 in delivery. But where I brought the hardware from was largely out of my hands, as only Scan stocked what I needed at the time. And what I needed, as it turned out, was very specific. I'd done a lot of research, and to make this work, I had a laundry list of requirements from the hardware, and mismatched hardware was one of the most common ways people getting into mining ended up getting their fingers burnt. The GPUs needed to be reliable, be appropriate to the crypto that I've mined. So as I said, Ethereum was memory intensive, which is why we ended up with the For the Win editions of the EVGA 1070s. Basically, that it would have high enough quality memory that I could overclock the nuts off them, and have a good transferable warranty. The PSUs needed to be as efficient as possible, so they're gold rated, and support a minimum of 4 GPUs each. The motherboards needed to have enough PCI slots for a minimum of 8 GPUs, but ideally more for future-proofing. The only board on the market was a 13 PCI slot from ASRock, which is there. But not for nothing, Windows 10 actually has a limitation of 10 GPUs, so you could try and put 13 GPUs on that, but Windows 10 would only register 10 of them. So I spent 3 days putting the rig together, assembling the flat pack aluminium frames, and then reassembling them after I'd tried to attach the motherboards, realizing I put parts of the frame and back to front. It was a tedious process, and the novelty of unboxing all the shiny hardware soon wore off. After assembly, each rig consisted of a frame, 2 PSUs, a motherboard, 8 gigs of RAM, a Celeron CPU, an M2 drive, 8 PCI risers, and 8 GPUs. So what could go wrong? Lots. All the things could go wrong. I'd intended to use a Linux-based custom OS called SimpleMiner, which, being Linux, took the sting out of the CPU and RAM requirements. It was one area I was expecting to save money on the hardware, and this, as it turned out, was the first of many mistakes I would make. SimpleMiner runs off a USB stick that you stage with an NVIDIA or AMD-specific image configured with your wallet details. The idea is you boot the mining rig to the USB stick, and providing there's a network connection, it ticks along doing its thing, and you can view its progress remotely. Now, it's a clean, low-profile solution that includes lots of neat tools for you to remotely monitor it, reboot it, as well as adjust voltage and clock speeds on the fly. However, it's not a very robust solution, and it scales terribly. In mining land, you're constantly trying to undervolt the GPUs so they use less electricity, but overclock them so you generate greater amounts of crypto, all with as little downtime as possible. The worst position to be in is for the rig to be powered on, but not mining crypto. For the miner who's happy leaving the power and overclocks at stock level, it's fine. You'll never turn a profit doing it that way, but it's fine nonetheless. The moment you stress the hardware, SimpleMiner OS, the Linux solution, became quite flaky in terms of recovering itself, which led to a lot of downtime. So I wrestled with it for a few weeks, trying to find that volt clock sweet spot with the graphics cards, but I was in Linux land, and I was out of my comfort zone. I was getting more frustrated by the day, so I migrated to Windows 10, and at least if something went wrong, I would have some idea as to how to fix it. But the leap from Linux to Windows 10 necessitated even more cost, a faster CPU, double the RAM, some NVMe drives to replace the USB sticks. So the time it takes to mine a Bitcoin or any cryptocurrency is reflected in the mining difficulty level, as Mark talked about. When lots of people are mining a cryptocurrency at the same time, that currency's mining difficulty level increases. The higher the difficulty, the more hardware required to mine. By 2017, Bitcoin's difficulty had spiked by 8,500% year on year as more and more server farms came online. Such farms were stacked with ASIC miners in parts of the world where energy or ventilation was cheap. With all my GPUs online, I had been lucky to mine a single Bitcoin in a year. I needed to find an alternative currency to get in on. There were hundreds to choose from, and I knew I had to be careful which one I chose, as the danger of backing the wrong one would be that I'd have lots of tokens that months from now would be worth nothing. I went with Ethereum, the second most popular crypto by market cap, and still very mineable at the time. So, for whatever reason, mining software miners react very badly to drop network connections. More often than not, a broken network connection results in the entire mining software bombing out. And it's not as if there's a large selection of software to choose from either. The only ones that are worth using can be counted on a few fingers, and they also have to be matched very carefully with graphics drivers. The issue of network connectivity became a big problem for me. My miners were located in my spare room upstairs, and the network hub was in the sitting room. Wi-Fi wasn't stable enough, and power line adapters weren't cutting it. I needed a direct connection to my network hub. I got away with a LAN cable trailing up the stairs for about a week before my wife threatened to cut it in two. I'd solved the network problem in principle, but there was no getting away from the amount of heat the rigs were generating. And it was December, with all the windows open and the central heating turned off. The house was baking. There was no way I could carry on running the rigs inside the house. I moved them into the garage, where I thought about a longer-term solution, tracking a LAN cable from the sitting room and getting a very valuable education in the art of trunking cables in the process. It was around now that the PCI adapters started to fail. I bought cheap ones, but was starting to regret it. The adapters draw power through a Molex SATA splitter, bridging the PCI 1 slot on the board to the PCI 16 interface on the GPU via a USB cable, which you can see there, and you're welcome to have a closer look at the end. So these will replace with ones with uprated capacitors and solid inductors. So I'd used Afterburner, MSI Afterburner, to test each rig's undervolt and overclock tolerance and specified a preferred power curve for the GPU fans to follow. And there was a difference of up to 10% in the volt clock tolerances across my 4 rigs, which just goes to show not all hardware is made equally, even the good stuff. At a hardware level, the rigs were now reasonably stable, and that's to say if they weren't running the miner, they could be left on indefinitely with the new GPU maps and the systems wouldn't reboot. At a software level, I was encountering all sorts of issues. The overarching problem was the miner application crashing. I already had TeamViewer to dial in, but often the system would be down and I wouldn't be aware of it. I needed a way to make the system more robust. I needed to minimize the downtime. I'd seen some IP-based power switches in the automation lab at work that could be configured to ping for an IP and trip power if a heartbeat wasn't detected. Unfortunately, I needed 4 of them and they cost £100 each. They were pretty effective at automatically recovering the system in the event of a full Windows crash. They're controlled by a web-based GUI prefixed with their own IP address, and I port forwarded them on my router so I could dial into them remotely and manually initiate hard resets when I needed to. That didn't solve all my problems, though. A few scenarios kept presenting. The system would sometimes load but not detect all my GPUs at a device manager level, requiring a reboot, and the miner would periodically freeze or bomb out and fall back to the desktop, needing to be relaunched. I developed a PowerShell script that would run in the background, verifying the mining application was still running, as well as checking for the number of GPUs at startup and take appropriate recovery steps. I'd never used PowerShell before, so that was less than straightforward. My wife won't forgive me for this next bit. The rigs were stable, but the garage being attached to the house meant that the place was getting hotter and summer was approaching. My wife was very pregnant and made herself quite clear that she was increasingly uncomfortable. I needed to expedite the moving of the rigs into the shed at the top of the garden. The only problem was the shed had a big hole in the floor and a bigger one in the roof, and I had a big fear of spiders, which is why I hadn't got around to fixing it. I bit the bullet and went about replacing the floor and the roof. And that's the foreman. The shed had an electrical supply from the house, but it was only suitable for lighting. It would never have supported the 5 to 6 kilowatts I'd need to run the rigs. I rated the power supply, tracked the length of the LAN cable from the garage, and hardwired a CCTV camera. The network map was now router to sitting room switch to garage switch to shed switch to rigs. It's about 75 meters of LAN cable. I built a partition for the shed and a self-contained wooden box for the rigs to operate in, and that all went surprisingly smoothly, and the rigs ran well for a few days until they didn't. The temperature of the shed rocketed, but on the plus side, it was far too hot for spiders. The end was starting to feel like it was in sight, but there was one last issue of how to ventilate the shed. I added 2 intake fans that drew air from the outer partition for reasons of condensation, and 2 outtake fans that ejected air directly outside of the shed and covered everything in insulation. After a few months, the fans started to fail because the plastic blades were getting warped in the heat, so I replaced them with industrial fans made out of metal instead. That was when things really started to stabilize, and that was a good job because I'd spent about £18,000 at this point. That's what they look like now. When it's all been done. So, this is the last part. The mining pool that I'm associated with outputs a graph indicating my historical hash rate, and I had uptime of around 95%, but one of my 4 rigs was dragging that number down, and I wanted to get to the bottom of it. I looked at the miner trace file from the suspect rig and could see that it was regularly relaunching itself after encountering GPU errors, but this gave no indication as to which GPUs were erroring. I got back on the PowerShell and wrote a script that ran on each rig at startup to poll the event viewer for errors and warnings associated with state changes, pushing them to CSVs on an FTP server, and I then used Power Query to centralize the data into a visual chart. And after a week, the CSV was building up a picture of which were the problem GPUs across the rigs. I sent them off for RMA. The uptime went up to about 99%, and I was happy. And that's the end. So yeah, and if you've got any questions, you're welcome to ask, but if you'd like to have a closer look, that is a mining rig just there. So
When you break even.
I'll let you know.
When you asked when did you break even, you said, well, that's so yes.
From the reason, my motivation for doing this is because, well, I know I'm not going to make any money soon, and even if these went up to their previous, even if all my Ethereum tokens went up to their previous high, I wouldn't sell tomorrow because I have faith that crypto is the future, the democratization of currency, those evil Federal Reserve banks that have moved away from the gold standard, that are screwing us all over every single day, will be put out of business. And my brother-in-law is right that one day Bitcoin will be worth $1 million. And all the other alt currencies like Ethereum, which I'm involved in, do track a very similar trajectory to Bitcoin. So I hope my Ethereum will one day be enough because my pension sure as shit won't be.
Have the police ever been around yet? Find out what?
No, they went to my brother-in-law's house and they did ask that question, and he was very excited to walk them through to the garage, and they were very disappointed to get back out again.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Any questions about crypto as well? There wasn't much time for me to deal with them given how much there was to cover, but come talk to me afterwards.
Actually, after the question, all about already from the letter. But if I spend something, so hard drives sitting up like that.
You're like the fourth person to pick up on that today. It just needs a little screwdriver to... It's got an anti-theft system as well.
The hard drive, not screwed down.
Yeah, I lost the screws when I got them. They've been working okay like that though.
Can you get more efficient power supply? I'm sure you can get better than that nowadays, can't you?
Well, there's no point. There's no point in getting one which is 1,000 watts each. They're 850, which is enough to drive these with a bit of headroom. But any more than that, and they're going to consume more power than you need.
They're gold plating nowadays.
They're gold, but the titanium and platinum ones cost a hell of a lot more than the gold-rated ones. So they were the sweet spot.
You can upgrade them to 20 series?
Not even just one.
No.
When you get even
You need a ray tracing.
Sorry?
You need a ray tracing cryptocurrency. Do ray tracing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So you've got, what, 4 of these?
Yeah.
You got one spare?
I'm afraid not. I'm afraid not.
That's a good news for the VR. Yeah.
I would love to run 3D Mark on this. I would love to see what kind of score I got. But
Another question. You know those ant miners? I wonder how efficient are they? They say, if you get ant miner, you're gonna make a huge profit.
ant miners are ASIC miners used for Bitcoin. These are memory-based Ethereum miners. So the ant miners are superseded about every 3 months. So you spend 4,000 or 5,000 on an ant miner, and then the difficulty goes up. They're now worth nothing, and the next ant miner has come out. So it's a dangerous game to get into if you don't have a lot of capital.
Because they said that it will pay off in like 6 months or so, and then if they release a new one in 3 months, then you're kind of like
You get a similar problem with these. So these will need to be replaced as the difficulty increases. But actually, the next GPUs for mining are actually going to stop. That's going to stop in the next 9 to 10 months. They're going to be replaced with FPGA cards. So one FPGA card that costs £5,000 will do what 64 1070s will do, but cost 1/64th of the electricity to run it. And when that happens, I'm screwed. So if you want to buy some 1070s in about 8 months' time, come and speak to
When you
me.
put graphics card on the AI house, we should never do it, should we? Because they've all been working.
In fairness, it was just my personal 1080 Ti that I was selling at the time.
basically to be like most efficient, you have to have like a survey like bunch of like panels and I'll be able to see electricity for free.
It would be wonderful. My roof isn't big enough to help out.
Yeah. I didn't really cover mine. I think
They're 4 separate rigs on the same cluster. It's called a mining pool. They're all on the same mining pool. So they all mine in the same way.
they contact us for a sandwich.
It's a quantum thing.
Then there's pretty sure.
We mine the whole.
And there's such small amounts.
Yeah.
The scale is important.
Yeah.
Not doing, as far as I know, real-time transactions.
Can I leave this on for the rest of the day? Sorry, I'll take it down shortly.
The gap, yeah.
So a general rule, Twitter never invest more than you get spending more
So the more blocks that get tacked on after your transaction, the more certain we are that someone's not going to have
a general for actual investment.
My one's not right.
So how much would this be?
So if you're at a transaction of a million,
It's about 150%.
Yeah, I mean, if you consider doing different cryptocurrencies or something,
No, I'm all in on Ethereum, and it's a pretty safe bet. It's like if Bitcoin's the dollar, then Ethereum is the pound. They're not going anywhere. There are higher rates of return on the.
Try again.
So they're pretty safe. Hundreds of billions of dollars in market capital, of Ethereum. So there are more risky approaches. You can mine some of the lesser known altcoins, and tomorrow they might be worth 1,000 times more, but then the day after they'll be worth 100,000 times less. So.
Actually, I used to proxy rigs, and I wasn't the one that you sent like the number of games, the conditions. Anyway, as far as I remember, last time I checked, you can even still make profits with 9/7. Still, you won't make like probably make about
find the longest.
$6-7 per month. 9/7 is pretty hard, So when I started with the Radeon, and then I moved to 9/7.
Everyone's synchronizing it.
9/70, and then of course 10/80s came out, but then I stopped because the market went high, and then you couldn't acquire the car.
Well, I got quite lucky with the 10 series because NVIDIA dipped around for twice as long as the usual cycle of graphics cards. So I actually got lucky buying these at the start. They've had a bit more longevity than on paper they should have done, because historically NVIDIA will replace the graphics cards with a new generation every year. But because they sold so well and everybody was getting into mining, they really hung back on those in the 20s.
I sold mine rates just before the crash, which was last summer.
Yeah, you've done well. Now is a good time to buy them.
No. I think I passed this, and now I'm doing other investments. I can share later if you're interested.
You can do a food for thought.
I think yeah. So we're gonna have something to on price.
Concerned about the local miscreants realising you've got thousands of pounds worth of hardware and you're going, oh shit.
Fortunately, my garden backs onto a train line and it's not overlooked, and there's a motorbike anchor lock with 10 gauge wire cable going all the way through these, CCTV with motion sensor, and 2 padlocks on the outside of the shed, and a sonic alarm that has to be deactivated within 10 seconds of you entering the shed at 120 decibels. So I'll be interested to see who wants to have a go at Nicky. But technically I'm not insured.
Yeah, you have given us a lot of information about what's in there. Probably,
So when I started to do this, officer came over actually, and he wanted to check our house because he thought I'm growing cannabis.
Yeah, so your brother-in-law.
So I had to show him around what is electricity.
Have you considered the cooling system?
The cooling system? No. So these are EVGA cards for the Win editions. Now, EVGA made about 6 different 1070s, and these are the second generation of their top end of those. So the reason that they cost a little bit more is they've got a really nice aftermarket design cooling system, which is reflected in the cost to buy them. They're very robust, much better quality fans than you get in all the other aftermarket non-reference 1070s from other manufacturers, which is why I was saying I did my homework and buying it. But also, these are the EVGA warranty is really, really good, and it's transferable. And when it does break, so, no quibble. And I've actually just RMA'd all 8 cards in one rig over the course of a month, and they, no quibble, they just return them to you.
I was surprised that you don't have because like for example, I had like extra fan line going from both sides and one.
But I do have 4 industrial fans doing all of that for me.
I had like a line there, and then it was like fan here, fan here, fan here. It was like long from one side or second from the other.
Yeah, well, that's what those vent fans are supposed to be doing. So there are 2 fans at the bottom blowing into the bottom rigs, and then at the top of the box there's 2 sucking out, and they're circulating about 4,000 square feet of air an hour. Sorry?
You can still heat your house. You just have like a little pipe going into your house. It's like air farm.
All right, I'm going to get some lunch. Thank you very much for being so kind. On this project, just under 20,000 pounds. 20,000.
There are German and Chinese companies who make specific assets.
Yeah, but that's when you've got to get into Bitcoin, and you've got to think about the scale and so on. This is Ethereum, so it's you can't do ASIC. You can't use ASIC miners to mine Ethereum.
As far as I know, people will bought from Chinese company last year Ethereum, and that was much less than this price. Yeah, when you paid it, that's fine.
In the coins. I mean, whoever wants to feature a different that coin.
Did it work? It hang together. Cool, man.
So you got a feel for how much money it's made so far over the course of an hour or whatever?
At rock bottom prices, it's made me about 5,000 quid over the course of a year. But that's with Ethereum being the chemical price it previously was. So if that goes up to its previous high, then I'll be up to 50 grand. I'll be quids in. I've also got
that's profit, or is that when you
offset against the cost of about 4,000.
What with the electric, there's farmers' fields that are set up benefiting from the solar in-field tax, and basically they are paid for the electricity they generate, not the electricity they put on the grid. Basically, it's such that electricity that you put on the grid is of no value in any case, and all the heat up cables. They don't really pay you for what you put on the grid. So people generate electricity which they have no use for, and it just gets dumped and using the grid's cables and...
Wouldn't you have to be next to the field or something?
Well, that's it. Put your shed in the field, field of solar panels, find a farmer. That's a thought, actually. I think it's on the way, there's some... I'm trying to think where it was. Maybe it's on the A10. I saw there was a field with loads of solar panels.
There's a whole load in Blessing.
Right.
That way, and then there's one out the other way just before.
There's a whole way of solving electricity.
That's a bit of a way to be.
Oh, fascinating.
Yeah, well, I think it is fun, but it's incredibly stressful when it's not working, and it takes an awful lot of work work to fine-tune it to make sure it works. And the reason that and you go on eBay, you look at mining rigs, the reason that it's just littered with people just trying to recover a fraction of their investment is because they don't spend the time on the PowerShell and the fine-tuning to actually make it stable. Because you can't just buy it off the shelf and put all the bits together and expect it to turn a profit. You've really got to, it's like pulling hen's teeth. But when it works, and when you've got over that, it's self-sustaining and it's running.
I mean, like that came across, you've really got to know what you're doing, but I wonder whether or not, you know, I mean, it's like any technology, in time it's going to come down, it's going to be more accessible to people, and more people will be able to afford to do this sort of thing. The knowledge needed will reduce, it becomes more of a commodity, and then if more people have these rigs, then presumably that means that there'll be more value in Bitcoin.
Thought about, is there a way of packaging up my PowerShell scripts and making them sort of universal where people could buy it as an app or something as a way to take advantage of what I've learned and the redundancy tweaks that I've built in. You know, when the simple problems like Windows didn't detect all the graphics cards on startup, and people might not notice that for a month, and it's just sitting there and one of them is down, so you're down like 15% of your mining power, which is the difference between a profit or a loss. So just putting a bit of PowerShell around that to pull, and then getting your analytics out so you can see what your actual uptime is, and then, you know, the mining application is that application there is so flaky, anything seems to affect it, broken networks, so a bit of PowerShell to detect for when that crashes to get it relaunched as soon as possible. You know, it's those little things that make sure you have very little downtime. And you don't have a very big window for making a profit on this. You know, a bit of downtime and that's it. You might as well not have bothered.
Yeah, I would like to get into this, but I don't think my parents would be very happy with the electricity usage.
Well, yeah.
I remember one time I was at uni, they sent out an email because apparently somebody had been mining on the computers in the computer labs.
Yeah, I've heard of that kind of stuff before.
Can I take a photo?
Yeah, of course. Thanks for your friendly face at the front. I did look over a couple of times and I was feeling a bit shaky. Because I love all of this stuff. I could talk about it all day one-on-one, but I don't really like getting up in front of people and talking.
Will the transaction fee be enough for it to make sense?
Right. You going out for a cig?
Yeah. Once
I'll come with you.
So,
and the answer is we actually don't.
Put it on the floor, leave it there for a bit.
I don't need a desk.
just leave it running all day. No downtime. 1070. 1070.
And it is warm, yeah.
Yeah, that running range.
Do you get these in specific mining shops or general? It's dedicated.
Yeah, they're designed to be for mining. People use that word, but it just takes years to put it together. That was actually one of the things that justice was with that. And the only bar that's adjustable is this line. It's just everything else.
This bit could be signed forward and back.
No, my issue is I still 2 or 3 of them together, and then I start with the mother and realise these bars were plus the wrong ways. So I had to add on the first part. Yeah, because that's that week.
People still got Bitcoin. Yeah. To be worth anything, there's got to be a way of transacting them, which will involve ever increasing amounts of energy.
Then all that needs to happen is validators and network don't solve the puzzle. So I'm betting this much of my Bitcoin that this is a transaction.
Okay.
I'm not trying to allow this person to double spend. So you just have to get them to behave correctly.
But the transaction still has to be on the blockchain. It takes the energy to append it to the blockchain.
It's minimal energy compared to hashing something with proof of work. So literally, in proof of stake, if there are mechanisms where everybody is incentivized to do correctly. All they have to do is say, yeah, I agree that. They validate the transaction and publish it, and that's it.
Would that be a different blockchain?
There is a mechanism for Bitcoin to change, proposals, and it's driven by
Bit cash thing.
Bitcash or Bitcoin.
There was a
Yes,
split.
there was a split. That was to do with block sizes. But development group makes a proposal to the community and publishes the software, and then it's up to the network to decide, do we switch to this software? And that becomes a new Bitcoin. Bitcoin Cash was a fork which said that we need larger blocks now.
Might be able to do 0.2 when you're in subcrack.
You don't have to size.
What is 0.2?
Just we had one discussion about Python.
Okay.
I had to get lunch as well.
If they haven't done this, then they'll make them a lower offer. Really? Oh, very good.
So all the ones. So we get 3 hours. One of them has to be
always working.
That's what you were thinking.
This yours, is it?
Yeah.
It's not a 10-second.
It's quite warm.
Is it? He tried to say that.
Yeah, so it's normally quite cold.
Some place. This is quite light. It's fantastic. I like your phone really good.
Big respect, ready, Craig? Awesome, did. Awesome. You did. Yeah, it doesn't matter. Let's go.